Hey everyone, Reed here with Big Strong Book, and today we're going to be talking about Submission by Michel Houellebecq. Before we get into things here, I should know one thing I realized. I'm wearing this red, white, and blue tie-dye shirt, which I wore for the By Night in Chile review from last week, and there are a lot of similarities that I found just in that coincidence. One of which is obviously red, white, and blue, the colors of France. And there are a lot of thematic similarities between By Night in Chile and Submission. And I really enjoyed By Night in Chile, and I really enjoyed Submission. So who knows, maybe this red, white, and blue tie-dye will become like the yellow plaid, my version of the yellow plaid shirt. Who knows? But I don't have a physical copy of the book. I read it on an e-reader recently, and yeah. So let's dive in here. I knew coming into this of Michel Houellebecq's reputation. His reputation preceded him. Obviously known in the French literary world as it's kind of their bad boy, so to speak, always courting controversy, criticism, but with just a large devotion of people who really dig his work and who think he's not only one of the greatest, or if not the greatest, living French author nowadays, but one of the greatest in world literature, full stop. And reading Submission, this was the first work I've read by him. I have to say that I can see the truth in him being one of the greats, him kind of having his eyes and ears on the pulse of just general Western civilization in particular. And yeah, again, I tremendously enjoyed this. It was good. Just my the bad taste that Kairos had left. This was almost like a breath of fresh air. A breath of just disgusting, satirical, hilarious air. Because this is a satire, it's got some very funny, outrageous moments. I mean, we'll get into it in a little bit here, but the protagonist is just absolutely despicable in a very darkly humorous way. He's just a scumbag, and that's the point. You're not supposed to think that he's supposed to be this bright, shining star of civilization or something. So, one thing that I should note is, I mean, this book isn't that long. It's maybe about 250 pages, but I read this book in pretty much just one sitting, if not, or like one longer session, one shorter session, so maybe two sessions. I don't often do that with books, even books that are around, the 250 to maybe 300 page mark. I might split them up a little more. Kairos was around 300 pages, but that took me a number of days to read. And this I was just able to kind of absorb in an afternoon, and it was great in that way. So diving into the meat and potatoes of what this book is about. So Submission was published in France in 2015, coincidentally the same day as the Charlie Hebdo, if that's how you pronounce it, attacks on the Charlie Hebdo satirical magazine. I believe that the magazine had many times in the past that they're a heavily satirical magazine that always always has a bone to pick with religion, and it courts controversy in that respect, and it had for a while. But then I think, and again, I could be wrong, so please, if I mischaracterize this or get the facts wrong, please correct me in the comments. But I think the magazine had published either a cartoon or a caricature of the Prophet Muhammad, which anybody, like, for me, for example, I'm a huge fan of South Park, and South Park got into a lot of hot water around 15 years ago with their choice to portray Mohammed in the show, to physically depict him, and they were essentially threatened by an extremist group. But with Charlie Hebdo, there was a terrorist attack on the magazine's offices, and I think maybe 10 to 15 people were shot and killed. Just absolutely horrible. But this novel came out the same day, and you almost can't overlook that. And I think a lot of the prescience, or not omniscience, but the prescience that a lot of people attribute to Houellebecq, I think, has a lot of veracity to it. It's just maybe he has a dirtier, more observant eye than the rest of us do. I don't know. But this novel, published in 2015, is set in 2022. And of course, French presidential elections, and I think for sure presidential, I'm not sure about legislative elections in France, take place once every 5 years, usually on the year ending in 7 and the year ending in 2. So there's 2022, and there's discontent. There's a lot of just extremist groups that have been pushed to the fore, which, I mean, around 2015, that was starting to bubble, kind of extremism in the Americas, extremism in Europe as well. And for us, we saw it, of course, in France in 2017 with the kind of rise to the front of the National Front, led by Marine Le Pen, and was that brand of right-wing nationalism was kind of beaten back by Emmanuel Macron, who represented, or at least campaigned to represent. I can't speak. I'm not that well versed in French affairs and French politics in terms of policy, and if Macron and his party have made good on their promises over the past 7 years. I do not know. I mean, he got reelected, so I would assume that means that most people in France are content with his presidency and his party, but he presented himself, I believe, as kind of a center-left, center-right, somewhere in the center, as a center alternative to a brand of extremism, and it worked. And I think he won with like 2/3 of the vote in 2017. Again in 2022, it was a rematch of Macron and Le Pen. This imagines where that kind of centrist party has gone away. It's a socialist party, the National Front. So you kind of have the far left and the far right extremes, which, of course, looking at there are a lot of if you're looking at a political compass or a political graph, obviously far left and far right are complete opposites, but a lot of people sometimes draw the compass where it's not really a compass. It's more of almost a complete circle where you have like far left and far right, and they're right next. They're actually so similar yet so different and so far apart. But you have the socialists, like a socialist party of the National Front, and then you have the Muslim Brotherhood Party. So, and the Muslim Brotherhood Party, it's explained in this novel, has tried to kind of walk the line. They're not extremists, nor are they jihadists. And the jihadists kind of act on their own accord. They're not tied within the party. And the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood Party, Ben Abbas, is a very savvy and charismatic politician. And there's a lot of fear rippling through Paris, rippling through France at the beginning of this. And the protagonist is a college professor named Francois. And Francois is his specialty, what he wrote his dissertation in, was on the French author Wismas, who, I'll be honest, I had never even heard of Wismas prior to reading this book, but I am intrigued to check out his work now. But Wismas was, as far as I can understand, both from reading submission and then reading a little bit online about him, was tied in the early stages of his writing career to the naturalist school, which of course was personified by Émile Zola. And his writing apparently was marked with deep pessimism, and he at least he grew towards Catholicism. A lot of his writing focuses on Catholicism. I haven't read any of his work, so I don't know for sure if his pessimism left or if his pessimism was maybe playing around the edges of the plot, whereas Catholicism was more at the heart and center of it. But obviously, in times of great change and great upheaval, it seems that Wismas was kind of moving towards Catholicism, that he might have felt too that with Catholicism, with Christianity in general, that he was growing out of touch with what he perceived to be, and characters discuss this in the book, of medieval Christianity as the kind of root of the heart and soul of France is not only Christianity but medieval Christianity, kind of this kind of raw brand of it, which gets into, so Francois, he is just this kind of sleaze bag of a man. He wrote this 800-page dissertation on Wismas decades and decades ago, and he just eats microwave dinners. He has affairs with students. He watches porn. That's the extent of what his life is. It's just a very sad kind of, you would look at him, you would look at this character, and you would turn your nose up. You'd be like, really, man, and he's a guy who, his best of days are behind him. His pleasures are not even pleasurable anymore. He's just a man deprived of his soul, or at least he think he does. But Francois is concerned at the same time with what he perceives, or perhaps what Houellebecq perceives, as kind of an apathy in France towards everything, towards politics in particular. And you could argue, I know a lot of people say it's kind of the loss of culture, and that might be part of it, but it's the type of culture, the pseudo-intellectual cultural, that's the extent of it, where it's just kind of held in the reins of an elite. And this is where I think it ties in a lot to By Night in Chile by Roberto Bolaño, where Bolaño is very concerned with kind of this pseudo-intellectual literary community that just gets together to discuss these works of literature in the den, while in the basement political prisoners are being tortured to death. They put their blinders on, and that's kind of what Francois is a little confused by at the beginning of this. He's confused why people are putting the blinders on, or as he perceives it, putting the blinders on. And he tries to then kind of draw back in his roots and into his youth of studying Wismas, and he reads a lot of Wismas, and we see that with when we think the answers to all of our problems, that they lie in history, that they lie in literature, that they lie in some form of art, that art is the true revealer of everything. And while that may be true, as Francois starts to discover, there's just this disconnect even that writers of the past had. They may have been preoccupied with just trying to make an artistic statement or artistic flourishes without seeming preoccupied with the political matters of their day. Or maybe he thinks they are. I can think of French authors like Victor Hugo springs to mind as somebody who at least had the appearance of being very political. I think Zola was as well. Balzac may have been, I don't know. Balzac, I think, just wrote and drank coffee all day, and that was about it. Not a knock on him. I love Balzac. George Sand, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, all, and then even perhaps, I don't know, even getting into the existentialism of Camus and Sartre. And I haven't read Camus or Sartre or Celine for that matter. I want to read all three of those authors, but there is that idea that you can look to the past, but you're not going to find the answers. You're going to maybe see how they did things, but then what they did is just what is happening in the present. They kind of moved with it. There was a great quote or a great observation that Francois makes about Wismus in particular later in the novel, which is that people are not really preoccupied with their own deaths. They don't really care about their own deaths. It's just mitigating the suffering that goes along with the death. And it's like, yeah, that's very true. If Wismus was concerned with that, but that's a great truth, is we're not necessarily preoccupied with our own death. It's just how much will you suffer in death. So anyway, back to the general plot of this. Essentially the Muslim Brotherhood Party emerges victorious. And their leader Ben Abbas is elected president of France, and kind of this sweeping, not necessarily fully Islamic or theocratic state forms, but in the universities, in the intellectual circles, it's almost a necessity to convert to Islam, or you're not going to have those opportunities. And I think one of the biggest criticisms about this book is, well, among many, is that the book is Islamophobic, or that Houellebecq is Islamophobic by transitive property of the book being Islamophobic. I don't think it is. Granted, I speak as that as somebody who is not Muslim, so I should say that. But I think throughout all of history, there were times when ideas or organized belief systems, whether they be purely political or whether they be religious, have been perceived by societies, by nations, as not necessarily a threat, but a recognition that if this were to really work its way into the political system, that it would fundamentally change things. Not necessarily for the worse, but that it would be a fundamental, complete change. I think the same one thing could be said for the general Western fear of communism. Communism, of course, not tied to religion necessarily, but that was a fear. And in this, this war on terror phase of history, where we have gotten high profile Islamic extremist terrorist attacks, that for groups of people, they can perceive that as, if this were to take hold somehow, it would be a fundamental change. And so Houellebecq is exploring what happens when fundamental changes may occur in a society, and what the people do, which ties back to the Wismus observation of people aren't preoccupied with their own death. It's just mitigating their own perceived suffering. It's things that they might have perhaps deemed that they would never do when unthinkable start to seem appealing, or perhaps it appeals to the worst desires within them. Because, the protagonist of Francois is a very, very despicable person, and he is, I think, quite misogynistic. The character, again, you can separate character from the author. The character is certainly misogynistic, almost a sex addict of sorts, but and there are many people who try to kind of pull him in and say, you can convert, you can have a position of respect at the university, and you can have many wives, and he compares that to his life in what some would consider to be more or less restrained circumstances, or freer circumstances, he felt depressed. He felt that the best of his life was behind him and that there were no opportunities. So, grasping at straws, he just kind of goes with the a more or kind of goes with the new ideology. And but we see that all throughout history. You'll get people who, especially, and he mentions intellectuals of people who kind of aligned themselves, intellectuals that aligned themselves with more with these various ideologies, be they extreme or not. Intellectuals will always side on one side or another for various reasons. Ultimately, it's probably just to diminish perceived suffering, which is a great observation and something that I had never thought of that much, or at least in those terms, until I read this. And so I found that quite interesting. And I think what Houellebecq is saying beyond that is that's kind of what it's like, at least in Western society. You'll get people that will their stomachs will churn at the thought of something that perhaps is perceived as a more extreme cultural norm or extreme political ideology taking over. They'll be like, I'll never be involved with that. I'll move away. I'll do this. I'll do that. But they don't. They just kind of change their beliefs to mitigate suffering, which I think maybe Houellebecq is saying that all humans are phony when it comes to that. All humans, we kind of, without lacking that personal guiding moral compass or cultural, true cultural compass or whatever, that will just give in to whatever is the easier path, I think is what he's saying. But Francois does, and maybe Houellebecq is, as a lot of people think of him being just his characters, that he would do the same, and we could all say we would do one thing and would never think to do another thing if something happened in where we live or whatever, but we don't know until we're put in that situation. But it's a damning look, I think, at just general societal apathy to political concerns. I mean, and we all know, being obsessed with politics is a tiring affair, but it is certainly for many people a profitable affair. There's also another great section in this where he thinks to, like, of course, the politicized TV channels that one might be left wing, one might be right wing, and then as kind of the polarized parties get phased out, they don't have anything to talk about anymore, and so they're kind of stuck. And it's something where it's the great, I think, not double-edged sword, I don't want to say that, but it's just the great flummoxing thing of political participation is very important, but you get too obsessed with it, you get too into it, and then you still lose a part of yourself. But would you lose a part of yourself either way? It's the thing for which political scientists, intellectuals, nobody will ever have an answer for it, I don't think. But this is just, it's great. It's just a very more introspective, I think, than I thought it would be. But it's also great and funny. It's a biting satire, but at the same time, it's almost a sad inward look at where we are. Just as individuals apathetic or uncaring towards the political process, assuming that things will just always work itself out, when in fact, whenever we really start to think that, and whenever that becomes a widely held belief, that's when the opportunity is rife for extremist factions to make a play. The people that are truly obsessed with it and hold these perhaps outside of the norm ideals, or even way far outside. So this was a great book. Really enjoyed reading it. And it's a novel that flies by. It's obviously not a novel for everybody, that's for sure, but I had a great time reading it. And I will definitely be reading more of Houellebecq here in the near future. So, Submission by Michel Houellebecq. Let me know what you think of it, and as always, I will see you guys next time.